One of the big questions on people's minds, whether you look at social media or people that you talk to, is about the property market and what it's going to do in 2021. And is indeed the property market going to crash? Now, I've got to say I don't have a crystal ball, but I see a lot of people, particularly on YouTube, who seem to think that they do have a crystal ball and they're telling you one way or the other what the property market is going to do. However, what I'm going to tell you in this video is the methodology that I am following to give my appraisal of what is likely to happen. And I can't say this is entirely my work. In fact, most of it is not my work. I've followed many people who have talked about this, and I first came across a body of work back in 2015-16 talking about the different property cycles. So when I looked at that and then I looked at my own experience, I've been involved in property since 1973 when my brother and I bought a flat in the student area of Edinburgh, and we each took a room and then we rented out the other two rooms, which today would be probably thought of as a HMO, but that's basically how I got interested and started in property. So I've seen many ups and downs of the property market, and when I took this body of work and then related it to my experience of the property market, it made an awful lot of sense to me. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. There are also some fundamentals that I find people don't necessarily understand. And the first one is that property depreciates. Yes, you heard that right, property depreciates. See, most people think that property appreciates. And at this point, you're probably thinking I'm mad and probably about to switch off this video because you think I'm completely off my rocker. But just stay with me and understand what I'm saying here. You see, it's not... When property prices go up, it's not the property that goes up in value. Yes, it goes up a little bit and goes up in line with inflation. Now, I know that as a developer because I build houses and the price each year tracks up. Usually between 2 and 4% on an annualized basis, the cost of building a house moves up. But what does go up is the value of the land. Now, it doesn't always go up, it sometimes comes down. And that's what, when properties go up and when properties crash, it's the land that is actually changing value. Now, an interesting thing is that I lived in the States, in Florida for 9 years. And well, not so much Florida, but in the US, the federal government allows you to take a tax deduction on the devaluation of the structure of the property. Not on the land, but on the structure that sits on the land. And they allow you to take a depreciation cost of that against your tax return. So they understand that it's actually property devalues, but land appreciates. So that's fundamental, and you'll understand as we go through this why that's important to understand that. So let's look at the property cycle. Yes, property does have a cycle, and in fact it's an 18-year cycle. Well, it's actually an 18.4 or something like that. Now, it doesn't always exactly go as 18-year cycles. There is a slight variation there, but it's a very, very useful guide. And I think for the benefit of most of you who probably can't go back to 1973 as I can, in terms of you, I'm not saying that you weren't necessarily alive then, but you maybe didn't have an interest in property or wasn't involved in property, so you maybe don't have that basis. Let's talk about the most recent event that probably that you have an understanding for, and that would be the crash in 2008 when property prices crashed. But actually it was the land that crashed. So we had a very high peak, as you will remember, and then prices came down. And at this point, nobody was interested. There was foreclosures. People were still trying to sell properties. I saw some properties for about 4 years that just had continually a for sale sign. You saw for sale signs up, saw some people take for sale signs down because they just couldn't sell the property, but were some people that left them up and they never got a sold sticker on them. It just never moved. I went to auctions and there was land coming up for sale at absolutely stupid prices. and they couldn't even get the reserve price for them. Nobody was interested in them. So land was the thing that had actually crashed. And we'll talk about why that crashes and what the effect that has on the general stock market. Because in fact, what actually happens is that the land price affects the stock market and the stock market crashes. But you will see that in a different way, because you'll actually see the stock market crashing and then house prices crashing. But it's because of the land. So we come through this whole period here, and then in about 2012, we're starting to see an uptick. Now, when I say we start to see an uptick, we see an uptick in London. We don't see an uptick in the rest of the country. Now, I've been through about 3 of these different cycles in my experience with property, which is most of my life, because I got involved in property when I was age 16. And so, so here we have this uptick, and it always starts in London. It always starts to recover in London. And what then generally happens is that it carries on, and there's some good appreciation in London, and it gets to a point where the rest of the country is slowly starting to waken up to some increases in values, but not very much. And in fact, the further you get out of London, the less and less it becomes. So places like the north of England, Scotland, have very little movement, and they keep hearing on the media how how property prices are booming, and they're thinking it's not happening here, and that's because it isn't. And of course, that brings me to a different point, is that the media is very London centric. So when you hear prices crashing in London, they may be in your area actually increasing. And of course, there are other things that will affect it. And then we reach this sort of blip. And at this point, the media, again, is starting to say a crash is on its way. And it's all going to happen. And if you look at the media posts about 2019 and currently this year, 2020, of course, we're living through the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of noise in the media talking about how this is all crashing, it's going to come tumbling down. Currently at the moment, the government have put in some stimulus, which is helping to actually then bring us out of that curve. But nevertheless, I believe that we would be there anyway. So the big question is, as we go into 2021, once the stimulus starts to be withdrawn, are things going to crash? And I would say no. And the reason I would say no is because the land prices are not at the point where they're no longer affordable. And you see, it's developers, particularly the big developers, that have the influence on the market, because what they're able to do is they're able to buy the land, and as long as they can buy the land at a viable price, they can build and make a profit. But once the land gets to the point where it's too expensive for them to be able to build and make a viable profit, they start to pull back on the market. And so this is when we get to about this stage here. And this is going to happen around about 2024, that you're going to start to see the developers starting to pull out of the market. But house prices will still continue till about 2026. And this is what's referred to by this body of work that I follow as the winner's curse, because we will probably get a crash around 2026. And people will have got to the point where they've got so involved in the market and the euphoria that they're starting to pay really stupid prices. As we saw, if we go back about 2006, going into 2007-8. In fact, if you go back, to 2005 probably, that's when it really started to get maniac. And there was just this huge, people believed, the media was telling you that things would just carry on, that there would be no crash. and everything would be fine. The banks believed it because the banks were lending just like crazy. They were lending without you almost having to certify your income. They were lending at 120% mortgages. In other words, they were lending 20% more than the surveyor had put the valuation on that property. And so therefore, what then happens is that the stock market starts to realize that development has stopped and that the house builders are going into the doldrums. And that actually creates a stock market crash. Not only does it create a stock market crash, but suddenly now the banks are left with a lot of debt that they start to realize is not going to be repaid. And this is where we were back here in 2008. And they need to spend the next 4 years, which is what they did, repairing their balance sheets. In other words, trying to put things in good order. Now, the difference is when we sit here at 2020 is that the banks are not in this state here. In other words, they may be a bit cautious at the moment, but they're not ready to start pulling the lending because their balance sheets are in very, very good order still. So they're in good shape, and they're not going to stop lending, which is part of the reason why prices start to crash. But it still fundamentally comes back to the land. So will it be 2026? Well, I have to say there's another cycle that's in play here, which may extend it to 2029. Now, if we think of this current COVID-19, there's a 100-year cycle in play here because we had this major pandemic which reflects Spanish flu back in 1918, and then 2019 we have another pandemic. 1929, of course, you'll be aware of the stock market crash. Perhaps this will continue on until 2029. Again, relating something back to history, if you think about it, Spanish flu, pandemic, and yet we went into a big boom period in the 20s, the 1920s. They called it, after all, the Roaring Twenties, not for good reason, that it was a very, very prosperous time. In fact, people felt so good. That's why the stock market crashed. There's some famous quotes about people, you know, like shoeshine boys giving stock tips, and people realizing who were involved in Wall Street at that particular time that when the shoe boy can give you a stock tip, it's probably time to get out of the market. And so confidence lacks and it then starts to crash. But the fundamental thing is it's the land that everything goes into. So it's the land value that controls the stock market and ultimately house prices, because houses are built on land. Now, there's a couple of other things that I'd like to also mention. Is there's a lot of talk and fear that we're going to have high unemployment, and we will. There's predictions of 3 million people unemployed. Well, I remember the last time we had 3 million unemployed, and part of what's happening here, although it's being easy for me to say that, right, you know what I mean anyway. So in other words, it's been caused by partly this pandemic, but it's also that there is a 40-year cycle of fundamental shift. If we look back at the 70s, moving into the 80s, we saw a fundamental shift. We saw industry that had become uneconomic, and we'd hung on to those industries by pumping government money into them. And then in the beginning of the 80s, we turned around and said, no, we're no longer going to do that. And so those industries, some of them disappeared, some of them changed, had to become more efficient. So there's a fundamental shift, and that caused higher unemployment on a temporary basis. When I say temporary, it was quite a few years that lasted for. I believe that we've been stacking up fundamental changes again, which we've been sort of like holding off against. So for instance, if you think about the advent of the internet, we've reached the point where retail has really struggled over the last 10 years. And I think we've come to that point where a lot of those industries are now, this is almost the last nail in the coffin, but it's almost would have happened anyway. So it may not have happened right now, but it would have happened in the next few years. Similarly, in the beginning of the 80s, the pulling of government money would have, if money had been still pumped in, it would have continued to go on, but eventually would have still hit the same conclusion. So all that happened by the government not putting money in was that they just brought the inevitable forward. And the same way as I think the pandemic has brought the inevitable forward. So, so we will perhaps have this high unemployment. But the other thing I would say to you is, or two things I would say to you about this is, while that may be 10% of the population unemployed, you've got to remember 90% of the population will be employed. Now, I'm not trying to be nasty about this, and clearly every person who's affected by this creates hardship and is very, very difficult. I'm not unsympathetic about that, but I'm just giving this on a purely factual basis. So please don't think I'm being heartless when I say these things. I'm just really reflecting what is likely to happen. Similarly, the same was with the situation in the 70s going into the 80s. We had a lot of hardship, but we also had a huge amount of prosperity in the 80s, and I believe in the 20s we will have a huge amount of prosperity. In fact, I would go as far to say it's probably going to be one of the biggest wealth generating periods in history for quite a number of years. So is this cycle ever interrupted? Well, it has been interrupted in the two world wars, but they were very, very significant events. And as significant as COVID-19 is, it's nowhere on the calendar as those events. You had an event that lasted 4 years, where everything changed, focused on the war, and then you had the same event which lasted 6 years with the Second World War. So huge change in way things were produced, everything, the whole focus was on the war effort. So major, major disruption. So I don't believe we're in that because I don't believe, although we've had some disruption, fundamentally those things are still there, and it may affect some industries, but it's still going to be, fundamentally everything is still going to be in place. So this video is part of a series of videos that I'm creating called Property Insights, and if you like this or dislike it, then please let me know. Put your comments in the section below. If you want to see more of these videos, then, and you haven't already subscribed, then please hit the subscribe button and remember to hit the notification bell so that you're notified of when next videos are going to come out. And if you think this might appeal to some of your friends and family, then please share it with them. I look forward to speaking to you again on another Property Insights video.